Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to the last talk slot. The stragglers, the people who are still here. Really cool to see you all here. Hopefully this will be a nice, relaxing talk to finish off the conference. And yeah, let's just get into it and explore some navigation libraries in Compose. So, hi, I'm Rikin. I build Android apps, as probably most of you do. I like comparing libraries. I did another similar iteration of this talk, and I also did a talk comparing state management libraries. So I guess that's kind of my thing now. And I'm a relatively new parent, so that's my son. I'm obligated to show everyone pictures of my baby boy. That's him right there. And I also run a little freelance app development studio called SuperGUI, where I work with companies to help them build out their mobile app. And one of the projects I worked on recently was actually a Hacker News client for Emerge tools, to find folks at Emerge tools. So if you are interested in a Hacker News client for Android, then it's on the Play Store. And it is also open source, so feel free to look at the code, but don't look at it too closely because it's mostly code that I wrote. And while we're on Emerge tools, so just to be clear, they didn't actually ask me to talk about their product at all, but I think they have some really cool products, and the one that I got to use a lot was their snapshot tool. And so if you haven't used snapshot testing, it's a really cool way, one, to kind of visualize the progress that you make as you're building an application. But I think Emerge's product is really cool because it took pretty much no effort to get started with it. It just leverages the Compose preview system and then uses those previews as your snapshot test baseline. And so here's kind of a before and after on where the app started and the last push before the release, and you can kind of see that the large screen sizes didn't really get that much love here, but there's still room for improvement. So what are we going to be talking about? Well, we're going to try and get our bearings around what is navigation, because I feel like it's this mysterious topic that a lot of people either have a lot of opinions about or confusion about, and let's just try and come up with a reasonable definition. And then I'll go over some navigation scenarios that I think good enough to kind of test these libraries out a bit. And then I'm kind of going to go into a little bit of a back and forth where I go into a little bit of a primer on the library itself, and then I'll go into a code sample to kind of show you what that code actually looks like, and then go through these various navigation scenarios. So I'm going to do that about 3 times to test drive 3 different libraries. And then we'll have some takeaways at the end. What's not on the agenda is I'm not going to be doing an extremely deep dive into any of these libraries. One of the kind of reasons I got into this was because I wanted to explore them from a new person who has not really who's not very familiar with these libraries. So a lot of it will be my perspective, using these libraries as best as I know how to use them. And if I encounter scenarios where I don't really know how to use the library as idiomatically as possible, I might have to jerry-rig a solution. I'm also not going to necessarily cover every navigation scenario or concern. There are a lot of things when it comes to navigation, but I did pick a couple that I thought were good enough to really kind of flex the libraries a bit. And I'm also not going to be announcing a new navigation library. I think the landscape is pretty flourishing and full right now. And on that point, there are a lot of navigation libraries in Compose. And part of the reason I was interested in this talk in particular was maybe I'm a little bit naive, but I was really curious as to why there were so many options. Because, are they handling navigation in completely different ways? Maybe they're trying to solve very specific problems. I actually didn't know. At the time, I really only had familiarity with the standard navigation system and navigation Compose. And so there are a lot of options out there. And the three that I chose to kind of play around with were one, Navigation Compose, since that's a good default and I have the most experience with that. And then I chose to play around with Circuit and Apex because I thought that they looked really interesting and I wanted to learn more about them. So before we get started, this is kind of like the working definition that I have for navigation. I kind of like to come up with my own definition to try and figure out, what navigation feels like to me. And it's still a little bit of a work in progress, but what I came up with is that, navigation is kind of a form of slicing up your application and determining which slice to show and how to get there. And the reason I use slice is because a lot of times you're dealing with layers of maybe screens or paths in your application. And I would use state, and I do sometimes still use state, but I feel like state is such an overloaded term. And so this is a definition that I came up with. And so when I was exploring these libraries, I've noticed that they usually centralize around three core components, and they are usually implemented more or less when they're creating their solution. And that's usually the state that drives your navigation, the display, and the controller. So your state, at least in my opinion, is kind of your routes, your graphs, your screens, the actual targets for your navigation, your destinations even. The display is it's often referred to as the host. This is going to display your active state. And a lot of times it also handles transitioning between different states. And then you have your controller, which is usually the thing in charge of your backing navigation model. Oftentimes that's a backstack. So the controller is usually what you use to actually mutate your navigation state, either by pushing new screens or popping those types of things.
Sweet.
And so the scenarios that I want to cover is one, integration with a common navigation component. So I'm going to be looking at how these libraries integrate with a bottom nav or a navigation bar, I think is what the newer one is called. I'm going to look at logic-dependent navigation, or at least what I'm referring to, logic-dependent navigation. And what I mean by this is oftentimes maybe you need to do something in the view model, and then wait for a result, and then based on that result, then actually navigate somewhere on that front. So, excuse me, any notification? But yeah, so essentially waiting for some logic to happen and then have navigation happen as a result of that. And then deep link support. Deep links are still pretty important for a lot of applications. So, what does that story look like for all of these different libraries? And so with that, we can kind of just dive in. The first one that I want to go through is Navigation Compose. That's probably the one that you all are most familiar with. Show of hands, how many people actually have used Navigation Compose in some way or form? Cool, yeah. So that's a lot of you. So I probably won't go into too many details on the library itself, but I will kind of describe the core components. So you have the nav graph, which kind of represents your state. You define your destinations and subgraphs there, and it also has routing information, arguments. You have your nav host, which displays your current active destination or current active route. And then you have your navigation controller, which is what manages your backstack and allows you to do things like change the destination, navigate to, and pop things off of the backstack. One other thing to note is that Navigation Compose tries to adhere strictly to this guideline called the Principles of Navigation. And so if you go to this document, you'll see a lot of sort of opinions on what is the correct way to set up navigation in an Android application. And so if you really want to adhere to these principles, using Navigation Compose will actually be really useful to you because it does try to adhere to those. But if you try to like, stray from the path at all, you'll notice that it feels kind of hard to fight and go against the grain. So just keep that in mind. All right, so now we're going to switch over. We're going to go over to the IDE and we're going to look at some code. So this is an app, and really quickly, the app is on the right here. We have a very simple, really, really simple application. It has like 3 main screens. This one screen, which has like an explicit go to 3, just to test out explicit navigation between sibling components. And then it has this photos feature, which is just like a feed detail thing. So like you can click and drill into like the detail. Very, very simple application. And so, and then if we look at the setup, I'm going to scroll down a little bit and you can see, oh, by the way, before I dive in, can everyone read the code pretty clearly? Good. Okay, cool. So, yeah, like this is a very standard setup. You have like a nav host set up right at like kind of like the top of your composition hierarchy. And then I have here, you can see like it's setting up a couple of different transitions. And then also has some routing. All of these routes are actually set up in like their own feature module. So it is multi-module. I did write the code for this before type-safe navigation arguments and routes were available. So I am still using string-based routing. So please don't judge me for that. And so it's a pretty simple setup. And so why don't we just like go through the different scenarios, right? So as you can see, when I was playing with the app, like the bottom nav does actually work, and it does, work with navigation. And so how is that set up? So you can see here I have a scaffold with a bottom bar, and I'm setting up my navigation bar. And the things that I commented out were actually the recommended way to kind of sync your state of the bottom nav with your nav controller. And for me, it felt a little bit odd because, for every other like UI component, I typically kind of use like my view model or my logic layer to drive like this UI state. And so one thing I slightly did differently was for my nav controller, I kind of forwarded destinations to my view model. And so like now there's like an action here that allows you to receive these destinations, then update like the actual app state that's driving the bottom nav. It's not like a perfect solution, but it is like a viable option if you do still want to kind of sync state between your nav controller and your logic layer. But that's like one thing that felt a little bit weird to me, but it does work. So like I can like click this button and it will go to the screen. And also you'll notice that the bottom nav does update when you do that. So that's one scenario. The other scenario another scenario I wanted to cover was that what I called logic dependent navigation. So I'm going to head over to the photos feature. Okay. And so this feature has like 2 different routes associated with it, and it has like the feed and the details, right? But what if, like for some reason, you wanted to, when you select an image, you wanted to do something in your view model, maybe like check if the user is logged in or has access to that feature or something like that before you actually navigate. And if you use Navigation Compose, it feels a little bit difficult to do that, I would say. And oftentimes when like you see these things where like you have like an action that needs to be handled in your view model that also has like a navigation associated with it, I see a lot of code like this. And I actually write a lot of code like this too, where you have like an action and a navigation kind of side by side. But really those things are like coupled together, and ideally I could just like call my select image and have like my navigation react accordingly. And so if we look at what that might look like, I'll head over to the feed view model, and you can see that I have this select image function that I'm not really doing anything right now, but let's say I did want to represent like some logic. Right here, I'm just adding a delay. Maybe I'm like making a network request. And then what I'm doing is I actually have to create some marker state in my UI state here. So I just have this like selected image, nullable image. And basically when I set that, that's going to let my UI know that like, oh, navigate, like we now have to navigate somewhere. And so if I go back to the content, you can see I have this like launch effect set up. So check for that state and say, okay, if that state's not null, I'm going to navigate to the destination I need to go to. And I also even had to like set up this like state clearing because, you know, after I navigate, you know, I need to clear that state because it's kind of ephemeral. It doesn't need, it's like a one-shot thing. So it does work, and there's probably a better way to set this up. But I guess my point is that it's not very easy to set things up like this. You do have to go through a little bit effort. But if I do set it up properly, then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment this out. And I think now if I run everything, we should still get it to work. So I click it, should like wait a second and then navigate. So yeah, so like it can work, but it did take a little bit of work to set up. And then the last scenario is deep linking. And that story is pretty well, I mean, it works really pretty well with Navigation Compose. You can see on these routes that all I really need to do is set up these deep link arguments when I'm setting up my routes, and then pass in these like these URI patterns that it should be able to handle. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try and navigate to a detail of one of these images. And so let me just go ahead and terminal, see, okay, I'm going to, well, first let me actually back out of this app. And then I'm going to deep link. I'm going to try and deep link to the second image in feed and go to the details. I'm going to use navigation, and you can see it works. And then like I click back, it still like creates the backstack structure. So that's pretty nice. It did just kind of work out of the box. So definitely one other consideration. Now I'm going to go back to my presentation, and cool. So that was Navigation Compose. Now I'm going to take a look at Circuit. So Circuit is an architecture, what I'm calling an architecture as a service by Slack. You know, it's pretty interesting. It defines these UI presenter pairs as circuits. Pretty standard, I guess, like unidirectional data flow. UI consumes UI state, produce UI events. Presenters consume UI events and produce UI state. But the real interesting part here is that presenters are essentially composable functions, which is a really interesting paradigm shift that I'm seeing, where we're using the compose runtime outside of the UI layer. I think Circuit really leverages that well. And it has its own navigation system that's also accessible from your presenters. They have first-party support for that. So that's also a really interesting thing. So we're going to be taking a look at that. So this is just a diagram that I stole from their documentation site. And one thing to note here is that the counter screen is this kind of like marker interface or marker object that's going to kind of glue your presenter and your UI together. And so when it comes down to those like core components, what you'll see with Circuit is that you have these screens. Now screens are actually used for a lot of things. Usually they house, say, like your display state and your events for different UI, different screens in your application. But they're also used as the routing mechanism. As you'll see, your backstack just maintains a list of screens. And then for your display, you have to just use this navigable circuit content composable, which is going to display the active screen on your backstack. And then for the controller, you have the navigator and backstack combo. So you can actually create your own backstack and give that to your navigator and then have the same kind of operation that you might be used to, like going to a screen, popping things off the backstack. Okay, so now let's go back, open up Android Studio, and I'm going to open up a different app. Okay.
Good.
Cool. These out the way. So this is essentially the same application, right? Same 3 features, same behavior, more or less, but now this is implemented using Circuit. And so I'm going to go over to main activity and kind of get acclimated a little bit. So you can see here, the one thing you might see is just like a circuit object. Now, it's probably not recommended to just like throw this in your composition into a remember. Typically speaking, it seems like Circuit would want you to have this on like your DI graph, but for sake of demo, I just kind of set it up here. Also, I kind of needed to set it up here so that I can get access to the navigator for certain things. But I will also caveat this by saying that like I definitely struggled a lot when it came to like learning about Circuit and like I guess getting acclimated. It is a quite a different system. So probably the things I'm doing here, there are better ways to do that. But again, this is kind of just like what I was able to build given like my knowledge and the documentation. And so so you build this circuit, right? And the circuit has like, here's what connects your screens and your presenters. You can see there's a bunch of like built methods called like add UI, which ties your composable to the screen interface. And then you add presenter factories, which allow you to create your presenters and pass them dependencies. And then when it comes to displaying, if I go down here, you can see that navigable circuit content that I was talking about. And then you kind of pass it your navigator and your backstack. And you can optionally set up like a decoration, which allows you to kind of like do transitions. And then that is essentially the setup. And so let's start going back into the scenarios that we were talking about. And the first one is bottom nav integration. And if we look, it's a pretty similar setup. Have a scaffold with a bottom bar and a navigation bar. And I felt like I wanted to set this up, with a more circuit idiomatic way. But unfortunately, the only way that I could really get like a global bottom nav working was to just maintain the state outside of circuit and just access the navigator itself. And so like if we look back up here, we have set up a navigator, which allows us to navigate to our different screens. And so with this navigation bar, I'm just taking nav item from my state. And then when I click them, reset the navigator route and update the state. And so that integration probably can be better, I'll be honest. But that is what I was able to come up with. And it doesn't actually work in all cases, as you'll see when it comes to deep linking. But it does work in this case. And then if I select go to 3, you can see that it does actually select the item, or the bottom nav item. Oops. Cool. Then the next scenario that I want to cover again was logic dependent navigation. So I'm going to head over to the feed screen. And essentially that same scenario, right, where like I want to potentially do something when I click on this before I go over and navigate to it. And the story here is actually a lot more straightforward. So if we look at this feed presenter, you can see that it has a factory that I mentioned before. And that factory can be used to pass some dependencies to your presenter, including a navigator, like the navigator that we created towards the root of our composition. And so I can use this navigator and pass it into my presenter. And now my presenter has a reference to a navigator to do navigation events. So in that similar scenario, if I wanted to do something, I can just like do uncomment this delay to simulate a like network request. And if I rebuild it, you'll see that like when I click on one of those images in the feed, it's going to wait a second and then it's going to navigate to that new screen. And the nice part about this is that like I actually don't need to update my state at all in that scenario, right? Because maybe this action doesn't actually lead to like a UI state update for that particular feature or that particular screen. But I can choose to just not do that, and I can just delegate to my navigator in the same place where my logic events happen. And so if I click here and now I click, it should wait a second and it should still work. So that is great. And then the last thing was deep links. And so this one's also an interesting case because if I go back to main activity, you might have noticed that like when I set up the backstack here, which remember savable backstack, you can actually pass it an initial backstack, which is just a list of screens that you might want to prime it with, essentially. And so when it comes to handling deep links, really what you can do is just like, in your main activity where you can handle intents coming in, you can check those intents and handle those deep links directly. And then you can kind of use that information in the deep link to help you construct what your backstack should look like. And so in that same scenario, when I want a deep link to a very particular screen in the feed, I can just handle that deep link and then construct my backstack accordingly and pass that to my backstack as the initializer, or as like the initial backstack. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to exit out again. Let's open this up. And then I'm going to use query parameter syntax. Open this circuit. You can see it works. Like I mentioned, the bottom nav integration isn't quite working here. But you can see that if I go back to the feed. And so it's pretty interesting because you do have to be a lot more explicit about handling the backstack for deep linking. And in some ways, I feel like that is also really nice because you do have kind of full control over what the experience looks like. Okay, I'm going to go back to presentation. All right, last one. So now we're going to look at Apex. And Apex is a navigation / architecture by Bumble. And the main concept that you want to understand here is that it's a tree of nodes. Like that's probably like the most important concept is this node. And so your node is responsible for a lot of things actually, but it also helps render you your UI. It can have like parent-child relationships. So similar to just like a tree structure. And your navigation is directly tied to the structure. And so you'll see that like by adding nodes and removing nodes from the tree, that's what helps kind of like drive navigation events. And then there's also this concept of components. And so like components are what you use as your model for navigation. So one example is they have like a standard backstack component that you can use. So maybe you have a parent that uses a backstack component and it has children, so that it'll behave like a backstack. But an interesting thing is that each node in your tree can have its own component, which can lead to some interesting results. Maybe you can have like a child that uses a backstack, but each of its children use a different type of component. They have another spotlight component, which mimics kind of like a view pager. And it leads to some pretty interesting results. And then, so this is a GIF that I stole from their doc site as well. And it kind of shows you like what your structure ends up looking like. You do try to create a root node, and then you can kind of like branch out into different feature areas, discrete features, and those features can either have, those nodes can have children that they're delegating to, and those children can have children. So you can like ultimately make your way down to like the leaf nodes to help determine like what you're rendering, and also determine what state navigation is in. So kind of like tying it back to those components. So with Apex, you have this idea of like nodes and nav targets. And nav targets are essentially just a sealed class that you can define to define like what children you're expecting a node to have, and then what nodes they'll end up mapping to. And they can also have, nodes can also be like leaf nodes, so they can have content and they'll render that as like a composable. And then you have your node host, which is going to display, it's going to create your root node, and then it's going to display like what the current active path is in the tree. And then, like I mentioned, you have components, which kind of help you decide which child nodes are the active nodes, like in a backstack scenario or in other scenarios as well. All right, so last one, let's dive into it. I'm going to close this project, open up a new one, and head over to main activity. Close these out, and I'm going to open this out. Okay, so by now it should look pretty familiar. Same simple application, same bottom nav, and same essential features. But let's kind of see how things are set up here. I'm going to go over to main activity. And you can see here that I'm setting up a couple of things, but the main thing I want to point you to right now is this node host, which is kind of like your navigation host, and it's setting up your root node. And if I look at root node a bit, one of the interesting things here is that Apex actually provides some support for different navigation, different material navigation components. So here I'm actually just leveraging their own Material 3 navigation node, which actually builds out the bottom bar. And so it actually was pretty easy to set up bottom bar integration. And you can see that it actually just works when I do explicit navigation or if I just click on these things. So that was really nice. You did have to set up a little bit of boilerplate, which if I go back, I set up this like state, which represents like the various children that node will have. And then I had to create a function that maps my like nav items to like their bespoke Apex nav item, but it was pretty simple to set up. And then each one of these nav items like has the child node that it represents. And so then if I want to like look at that logic dependent scenario again, I'm going to head over to my photos node. So there's a lot going on here, but I'll try and like go over it a bit. And so this is an example of like how you would set up a parent node that potentially has children. What I did was I set up a sealed class called nav target, which has the various children I might want to represent. One would be the feed screen, and then one would be the close-up. And similar to, how you might set up type-safe routes now in Navigation Compose, you just create classes, you create types, and navigation arguments are just values or constructor arguments on those types. And so if I look, there's a function on each node called build child node, which will be able to, when you add a different nav target, it'll be able to map that nav target to the actual node. So here I have like a feed node, which will just render the feed. And like I mentioned, you can also have content functions that are just composable functions that allow you to render your content. And then we have a close-up node here, which just allows you to pass in the item ID so that it can load the correct image. So if we wanted to look at that logic scenario that I talked about, it's actually very similar to how we did it in Circuit. But the interesting thing about nodes is that they're responsible for both like rendering and logic, which, might feel a little wrong, but that's kind of how things are set up here. And so if I wanted to kind of add that delay again to simulate some work, what I could do is when I am navigating and creating my feed node or close-up node, there's actually a lambda here that will actually add the close-up node to the backstack. I can just like launch this lifecycle scope, which is actually a property on the nodes themselves, and it's guaranteed to like be scoped to the lifecycle of that particular node. And then I can add some delay, and if I were to load that again, it should work pretty similarly. So again, it's very interesting because navigation feels a little bit easier to set up scenarios like this, but also in this particular case, it felt a little weird because like Apex feels quite different from like what standard Android development feels like right now. So the last scenario I wanted to cover again was deep linking, right? And this is also a very interesting one, so quickly cover it. For deep linking in Apex, you actually do have to set up very explicit routing to support it. And so if I scroll back up, essentially what I have here is this navigator. And so I have followed the documentation in order to help set up deep linking. And this navigator is not like something that's provided by the library. It's actually something that you can create. And it's extending this node-ready server, which I'm not going to get too much into. But essentially, it allows you to add this as a plugin to the root node. You can see I have the navigator right here. And this navigator just waits for, in this scenario, just wait for the root node to be attached to the tree. Then it can like grab a reference to it. And then now we have like some explicit navigation functions. So like if I want to navigate specifically to that close-up detail screen, I have to set up functions on each of my nodes to like kind of to set that up. And so like root node has a function called attach photos, which is going to attach a photos node. And then attach photos has a couple functions like waiting for the feed node to be attached. And then it also has attach close-up, right? And so that's going to attach the close-up node. So you do have to be very explicit about it. But again, that's not necessarily that problematic. It actually does give you a lot of flexibility. And so if we see, and then like I think have one function here for handling deep links that will just leverage the navigator when it matches a pattern that I want to deep link into, and then call it. And so let's just see how that looks as well. And first I'm going to back up. And I'm going to try this again. It should still work. Go into this route. And yeah. So it's pretty cool. And because I set up all of those things as suspending functions too, you can even like wait before you get to the next destination. I don't know if you necessarily want to do that, but it does provide a lot of flexibility. So yeah, pretty much that's it. And let's go back to the presentation. Cool. All right. So that was a lot of just like looking at code, getting a little bit familiar with these libraries. And so my takeaways are, I feel like I went on this journey for a little bit of clarity, but I kind of feel like I'm more confused now than I was. And not necessarily in a bad way, but I was kind of exposed to a lot of different like models of navigation, a lot of different ways to represent navigation state, a lot of different ways to implement navigation in your application. And so I'm not necessarily closer to one that like I feel like is like the best navigation solution, but I do feel a little bit more empowered to, I guess, like figure out what things I find important to help me guide my decision making. And one thing that I really feel like it's important is this concept of like navigation state being application state. A lot of that stem from the fact that, especially with Navigation Compose, it feels like there are like two sources of truth when it comes to state. You have your navigation state, and then you have your application state. But I feel like when you kind of marry the two, it does lead to a little bit more of an elegant solution, especially when a lot of times those things are coupled together. And I feel like a lot of times those things are coupled together. And so I think that like solutions that kind of like adopt this really are ones that I would prefer. And then building a navigation solution is a really hard task. So like I think it's easy to like, be upset that a navigation solution doesn't really fit all the use cases that you have. But you got to remember that these are pretty hard problems to solve. And so definitely feel the right to have opinions. But, as I was going through these, I realized how much work goes into building like a navigation solution that tries to be a general purpose solution. So it's not an easy task. And that is my talk. Thank you guys for staying till the end of the conference. And that's my email if you ever want to reach out. And I have a QR code to my Twitter, which is what I still primarily use, and where I'll be sharing the GitHub and the slides when they're up. So thank you all.